This is KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California, and this is Mae Brussell speaking. This is World Watchers program, now beginning its broadcast number 653, June the 11th, 1984. Last year, I began a three-part or four-part series on the relationship of the organization known as Western Goals to the Washington powers that be for the former Chief of Staff, Admiral Moore, on the board of Western Goals, and the links of that organization and the people on Western Goals, the head of it, Larry McDonald, to the violence at Munich, the Olympic game massacre. On one program, I said the 1976 Olympics, but I usually mean, and it is the 1972 Olympics, so we'll correct it right there. They took place in 1972. Just at the end of May last year was the expose of the Los Angeles Times linking the Los Angeles Police Department to the computer in Long Beach belonging to J. Paul, a $100,000 computer paid by Larry McDonald. And that opened up a whole can of worms of the police department in Los Angeles to the head of the John Birch Society, to the wife of John Reese, Louise Reese, who worked with Senator Joe McCarthy with the House on-American Activities. And I was talking about the Los Angeles Police Department a year ago, and tonight I'm going back to it, a full cycle of the link of the police to what is happening now. The Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese administration in California, the information that was in those computers, that case was hushed up, and the police department settled $1.5, almost $2 million settlement, not to go to trial on this particular case. They were ready to pay the money rather than go to trial. Incidentally, a Mr. Cleghorn from the police intelligence that worked with J. Paul and had things to do with the Larry McDonald Western Goals file is now running for the assembly up in California, from the police intelligence to the security for the Olympics, the Los Angeles security team, and now he's running for the assembly. As long as they settled out of court and paid a fee, which is an admission of guilt, I don't know why this man should be able to go up to the California Assembly and be with Ed Davis, the former chief of police of Los Angeles Police Department that set the network of a Gestapo before Mr. Daryl Gates took over. Cleghorn, who worked with J. Paul, is now running in the Assembly. Well, just this week, an interesting lawsuit was filed apropos of the Larry McDonald story. Remember, his name was linked in the end of May of 1983. And August the 18th, his name was on the front page of the Washington Post with his relationship to the Los Angeles Police Department and the suit that was going on there. And within several weeks, on September the 1st, Larry McDonald was killed in that airplane, the Korean airline. Now, Catherine McDonald, the widow, has filed a $105 million lawsuit for her husband's death. And this one case was thrown out in New York, and they refer to that case because I was shocked at the judge's decision. But I want to read you from the Houston Post. The widow of Larry McDonald wants $105 million because of the death of her husband. She's not suing the Korean airline or the Korean government. She's asking she's asking $17 million from the Korean airline. I'm sorry, that much from the airline. $7 million from the United States government, $27 million from Boeing company that built the plane, $27 million from Litton Industry that manufactured the navigation equipment, $27 million from Jepson Sanderson, designer of navigation charts that the plane used. The plane flew off course for several hours and strayed into Soviet aerospace. The United States officials have been accused of negligence and have been named in nearly 90 lawsuits that have been filed by families of 240 passengers. Attorneys for McDonald said the airline, number one, failed to exercise the required degree of care in transporting the decedent willfully and wantonly, and they performed hazardous operational acts with the knowledge that said acts were likely to result in injury to the passengers. They willfully performed hazardous operation acts with recklessness and disregard of the consequences that injury would happen, and they intentionally violated known requirements and standards of care with the knowledge that those violations would cause injury to the passengers. Now, I'm going to update the Korean Airlines story in a few weeks, but one article from the London Times describes the head pilot, the pilot for the president of South Korea, sitting with Larry McDonald in this plane in the back seats just prior before it went down. The suit said the federal government was negligent. It permitted the deployment of military planes, those are the C-135s, in the vicinity of the flight path of the Korean airline, the commercial plane. The complaint said the government should have known that when the radar returned from its military aircraft and Flight 007 would be similarly received on the USSR radar, and Flight 007 could not be mistaken by the Russians as a military aircraft and subjected to fatal defensive measures. What she's saying is they flew this spy plane alongside the other plane, really saying the Russians had no way. She's not blaming the Russians at all. This was a violently anti-Russian family, anti-Soviet, anti-communist. She's saying, what could they do? If you sent a military plane alongside my husband's plane simultaneously, the Russians can't distinguish between the military and the commercial, and you were negligent. Now, this is what I had part of this on the air a few weeks ago, April 19th. Chief U.S. District Judge Aubrey Robinson, who's handling the consolidated cases of the other people filing suit, said the courts, remember this quotation, have no authority to act on political questions and decisions made by the U.S. Armed Forces. Remember how shocked I was by this. He said the court may not appraise the necessity or desirability of conducting the reconnaissance activities alleged by the plaintiff. Such appraisal would involve the court in foreign policy determination calling for non-judicial discretion, so that the conduct of sending spy planes alongside his plane is the decision of the military, and the court cannot have precedent over the United States military, which means that any commercial plane you're on or any activity or spying they're doing, or if the equipment isn't working because they want you shot down. Now, what they did with Larry McDonald was he became a hero like John Birch, who was killed by the Red Chinese, the first American killed when the Red Chinese were in power. He was president of the Birch Society. He was caught with the Los Angeles police suit with his files in the Los Angeles Police Department. And as soon as he becomes public and gets attention, he can be shot down, made a martyr for the Birch Society, made a martyr for the far right wing that keeps referring to the terrible Russians, and get rid of them at the same time. That's what I was writing about last October, and that's what is in the news today. And I'm going to run down a few articles, not point by point in each of them, but some main points of news this week that I would prefer not talking about, but eventually, and sometimes we have to go into it. I like to do details of particular people like Robert Keith Gray or Edwin Meese or the biotech, but every once in a while you have to have an overview of history of what is happening and how it's happening at the present time. And I never saw 1 week where so many articles in this past week and a half put together, in essence, everything I've been trying to explain for 13 years on the radio. The way the articles ran is loud and clear. The first is a two-part story in the Washington Post, May 27th and May 28th, written by Rick Atkinson for the Washington Post. Thinking the unthinkable, the obscure office drafts the plans for World War III. The office is called the Defense Nuclear Agency, DNA, not the experimentation with genes, but DNA. It is an office in Washington, D.C., that straps rhesus monkeys into aircraft similar to the B-52, sends them off, gives them radiation, tests them, their vigor, and so forth. They experiment behind huge doors in the Pentagon. The nuclear explosion, the rays, they give 10 million volts of gamma rays to simulate the radiation from a nuclear explosion. They have rooms called the Aurora. the casino, the blackjack, the python, and more than 500 times a year. That's about 1 or 2 times a day sometimes. Without fuss or fanfare, they go into a concrete bunker down the road where they simulate war in a vault, 50-ton door, and the walls are as thick as a man's shoulders are broad, they describe. I mean, they are like, 4 feet or something thick, 50-ton doors where they lay out radiation, planning the next nuclear war. Now, they claim in 1963 the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on no atmospheric testing. So they go into this large underground with new weapons, the MX, the Trident, and they prepare to see what radiation blasts will be. The electronic circuits are all working, and they are using the most highly active weapons to test and preparing for World War III. The amount of radiation is horrendous. The statistics are overwhelming. But this was a 2-part story, 2 full pages plus, in the Washington Post on the preparation of the burns, the type of reaction of World War III. Now, Jack Anderson today has an article preparing for the big one. The secret Pentagon papers are getting ready for the power keg in the Middle East. Just the Armageddon is what they're waiting for, and it has to do with the shifting of power from the Muslims and from the Khomeini, who can move to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and maybe take the handful of Saudi cousins that run the whole country. The power of the Muslim group that got control of its own energy and its own vitality, and the game we've played, arming Iraq against Iran, and the confusion. And I haven't even detailed that for you in those conflicts, which I should. But Anderson has a story preparing for the big one, and the Washington Post has these 2 large stories putting the weapons through their tests and preparing for World War III. Now, the preparation of war is going to come in some very subtle way. It will be blamed on terrorism, just like Archduke Franz Joseph was shot and the World War I began, or Adolf Hitler put Germans into Polish uniforms and said the Germans were attacked at the Polish border. The excuses for war, the Reichstag, the bombing of the building, the chancellery in Germany, the government buildings, was an excuse to round up and begin the concentration camps and take control of the government because of the communist terrorists. Ronald Reagan went to England with the idea of getting all the allies to act against terrorism. Now, the big story out of England is terrorism. There's every bit of evidence that Libyan embassy did not shoot the gun. The gun was never found. There was no person named who shot that woman, the British policeman on the street, and Gaddafi has said that it was a provocateur situation. It was perfect prior to the summit conference to have that scene that went on, that siege outside of the Libyan embassy. Now, the countries are bankrupt. The cash is out of this country and other countries. We cannot maintain this war economy of building ships and weapons. The paper behind the meetings in London is filled with the bankruptcy of all the Western countries and their terrible problems of holding on to what they haven't got, which they already loaned out. And the scare of people that Ronald Reagan truly will get them into war. They read the Washington Post, too, and the London Times and other stories. So they divert it like Adolf Hitler did to the word is terrorism. And Reagan wants his allies not to talk about the economy, but to talk about terrorism. That is the catchword. That's why my article, The SLA is the CIA, was so important in 1974, 10 years ago. And one evening, I'll just spend 1 hour reading sections of that if you don't have a copy, or reminding you what's in it if you do. Now, in Congress, Reagan is asking for laws of housing people that he decides are terrorists. They're called self-styled civil libertarians that Edwin Meese and Orrin Hatch and Strom Thurmond and Mr. Jeremiah Denton will decide upon. And Congress is saying the anti-terrorism plan is like Joseph McCarthy's tactics. The Washington Post and New York Times and LA Times have stories. Senators assailed the new bill on terrorism. Well, Western goals has a big influence in Washington, D.C., and into the Pentagon, and the whole point about terrorism is that the people on Western goals were directly involved with terrorism, with George Habash in Lebanon, Fayoud Habash in Chile, and with the PLO, and they're going to use terrorism as the means to take away our rights, create the provocateurs. And John Reese's wife, Reese is the head of Western Goals and running their publications. She worked for Senator Joe McCarthy. Robert Morris, very active, worked with the McCarthy era, those people in the House committee and the terrorizing of various people and their blacklisting of their jobs. And Young America for Freedom was to come in and bring a group from Munich, Germany, and the United States to form to counteract the libs in America and take over the student activity around the campuses. So Reagan's in London talking about terrorism. Congress is saying you can't do it. And Washington Post, the New York Times rather, has a big article by Leslie Gelb. The administration debates anti-terrorist measures. Now, William Casey, the director of the CIA, wants to have a new, he's going to name a new czar. It'll be the head of the terrorism, the director of the Office for Combating Terrorism. And he will go into blacklisting people, naming people who are potential threats, and they're doing biological studies of left-handed, right-handed, right eye, left eye, potential terrorists, loners, broken families, you name it, rounding suspects up on biological statistics, which is what Hitler wanted also. So the New York Times has a story 3.5 years ago when Ronald Reagan was president. He announced that the most important thing in this country, the first national problem, is terrorism, not the mafia, not the heroin, not the cocaine, drugging America, not exporting our factories overseas, not closing up 100,000 farms this year and the farmers foreclosing, not the statistics of unemployment and the hardships that are not really put into the computers until after the elections. Then you'll see the story. He has had in his mind, this is a thing that he's been determined to do since he was governor of California. The day he became governor, he wanted to have that mind control center. His second term, he started UCLA, electrodes, implants into prisoners, checking children of Indians and blacks and minorities to see why they would rise up if they were out of food and hungry, I suppose, checking the terrorism of the minorities and not the white-collar crimes at all. Robert McFarlane, the National Security Advisor, has worked with Ronald Reagan on this terrorist outfit plan and with the CIA, and they discuss global issues. So that right now Congress is discussing terrorism. Now, also in the New York Times, I don't know how many of you saw it, Jeff Gerth's article, full-page article, United States military creates secret units in sensitive tasks abroad. I don't know why Gerth, who I always praise for his journalism, says they're secret units. They have showed their faces everywhere. These are the Rangers. These are the Special Forces. These are the Green Berets. These were the men formed by Mr. Siegs and Adolf Hitler's commando troops. They came out of Nazi Germany and came to the United States. The Defense Department is arguing about how much power the secret groups could have. But the importance of the Grenada invasion was that they tested the Rangers and the Berets and gave them the accolades that you are now American heroes. They want these people to operate under the Joint Special Operations Command Center at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And they have other offices. This is the Green Berets. These are your special forces, and they refer to them in this one article about their work down in Grenada. This is where they became prominent, where you took the fabric off the statue and they really got to work and overthrew and took a whole country. Now, one unit is described as the Navy SEAL, Team 6, SIX, based at Little Creek Naval Amphibious Base in Norfolk, Virginia. There's another group in Tucson, Arizona, which was a CIA base. What you have here is a group of people that were formed after World War II that are the essence of the Special Forces, the Gestapo, the SS, honed and trained by Otto Skorzeny and Adolf Hitler's teams, and to take countries, and these are the loyal people that similar to Hitler's special forces and teams, as I say, that swore to the 1,000-year Reich, the Waffen SS. When Grenada invasion took place, and Maurice Bishop was murdered. The first person at Maurice Bishop's desk was this Mr. Brown, who runs the Soldier of Fortune magazine, who sets up the mercenaries all over the world that work with the CIA, the death squads, the assassination teams. Brown was taking papers out with Michael Ledeen from Disinformation and Counterintelligence with his links to Georgetown. These are the private armies that will kill you. They will kill in the United States, and I believe they're behind the death squads of many people in the United States that we have not admitted exist. They are private mercenaries who can bomb places, kill, have car accidents, silencers. They go all over the world. They're for hire, but they are part of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the U.S. military is creating more of their units, working with the Pentagon and the CIA, and they are getting the power away from the standard army. You see, the enlisted army, or the army that you have to draft, includes Chicanos and blacks and a cross-section of America. And what they want is an elite guard who does the work, who goes in, who kills the heads of states, who kills particular people that are opposing selected government officials that we want. These are the commandos. That the taking of Grenada was exactly like Adolf Hitler's Blitzkrieg, the Anschluss. They went in swiftly, took the place, used the elite guard, gave them all medals, and now there's a large story in the New York Times, a controversy on how much power they should have and working in the Pentagon. The New York Times, again, Leslie Gelb has a story June 1st. The CIA said to assemble the mines in Nicaragua with Navy help. That is John Lehman, a staunch supporter of anti-Soviet activity that includes everything you want to do. He sent in ships. You see, we're not at war anymore. The United States was at war against Cambodia. But our Navy is helping the CIA carry their private wars. And this is a story about the U.S. Navy and the CIA weapons group that made the mine casings from sewer pipes, stuffed them with explosives. The United States Surface Weapons, the Mines Division of the Naval Surface Weapons Center in White Oaks in Silver Spring, Maryland, provided everything they did. Now, that is Henry Kissinger, like he did in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and so forth, carrying on in Cambodia, those wars. These are not secret wars. We are at war, and the Navy and the Army work with these little teams, but we're saying the little teams are doing it, that they are they are part of the large Pentagon, and they're part and parcel of the whole problem. The Joint Chief of Staff, as I say, are trying to resist this. A senior Defense Department official doesn't like it. They say that we can carry the weapons problems, the wars, and there's a conflict between the branches of the Army. The Air Force recognizes, according to the New York Times story of May 27th, the importance of special operation forces, and the Air Force will have a long-term plan to carry out the Defense Department policy. This is all irregardless of what Congress votes or Congress says. The Air Force spokesman pointed to the 23rd Air Force formed last year to integrate special operations and to recovery forces, and they absorbed the existing unit that was trained in the United States to increase United States combat capability. They use the Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, the Rangers, the Navy SEALs. The Air Force uses Special Operations Wing, so that all of them are combining together. Now, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Thayer reinforced this policy last October. Since October, he's kicked out of government, out of the Defense Department as a crook with foreknowledge of purchases and personal gains. He's one of the men that was behind these special forces. These are the most dangerous thing that ever happened to the United States military. Now, one of the men that's pushing these special forces, and they told Congress, you can't turn it down. The president wants it. There is an article to the United States Army, the heads of the chief of staff. You can't turn it down because this is what Reagan wants. The official, Noel Cook, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security, said that Ronald Reagan, his National Security Advisor, Robert C. McFarlane, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger says this simply has to be done. We need these special forces. Well, McFarlane set up another provocateur situation, which I said got us into this mess. There were a whole series of them. remember the Korean airline, the bombing in Burma of the South Koreans, the killing of Americans in Lebanon. These were provocateur situations, the creation of the medical school that said you have to come in and save us in Grenada. We've had a lot of actions that become the justification for further military repression and more elite guards. Now, Mr. McFarlane, who's the National Security Advisor, was the head of the Middle East in Lebanon. And just about 2 days before the embassy was bombed and the kamikaze car went in, for which there's been no trace, no prosecution, no evidence who did it. A lot of evidence that they had foreknowledge, that they didn't make the place secure. A lot of reason to believe it was like the Reichstag. McFarlane runs home from Lebanon because he gets out of the scene just a day before that happens, and he gets appointed as National Security Advisor just at the time of the Grenada invasion to take care of that, which tested the special forces that he and Reagan and Weinberger said we had to have. Now, McFarlane was a military assistant to Henry Kissinger from 1973 to 75. Just to tell you where he comes from, he was Kissinger's national security. When Kissinger was National Security Advisor, he was assistant. Then he worked for Mr. Scowcroft from 1976 to the end of the Ford administration, and Mr. Scowcroft is now part of Kissinger Associates, a private group that can make decisions and overthrow countries under the guise of clients of countries. That's the Kissinger Associates. Now, after he was in the Marine Corps, which is the Special Forces, a part of the Special Forces is the Marine, he also was made a special counselor to Alexander Haig, McFarlane. You see, the New York Times has a story that we have to have Reagan orders that McFarlane, Weinberger, and Reagan say we have to have this. Haig made McFarlane his counselor when he was Secretary of State, and he was used on all kinds of jobs as the troubleshooter. So he orders the Pentagon to do this. He's from the Marines, and this is very important because it will create the possibility for Gestapo in the United States. Don't think that the Berets, Green Berets, and the Rangers, the soldiers of fortune, the mercenary, are going to leave you alone in this country if you speak up against things that are happening. As I've said before, this country is going to become like Chile and Argentina. In fact, there's an article by Henry Kissinger about him in the paper last week saying that if you don't shape up and get more strict and rigid, you're going to look like Argentina. Well, he was close to those people while 40 to 50,000 people disappeared, and he's making a threat that our future will be like Argentina. And we'll do more about Henry Kissinger in a while. Now, along with those lines of my depression, or my really sadness of thinking how far these special forces have gone, formed by the Nazis, the plans for World War III, there was, and the use of McFarlane pushing this through, and the new terrorism laws that they want to put into effect, and the excuse for terrorism in London. To top that off, there was a story, a full 3/4 of a page out of the Houston Post. If you don't know this name, you better learn it, and if you're from California, you know it. It says the new Texas Department of Correction chief is a real plow. He's no diplomat. He says prisons are for punishment, not rehabilitation, and his name is Raymond PROCUNIER, the former head of prisons in California under Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan. The years that I was helping prisoners here, he was having killings in the yard out at Soledad. He was behind the San Quentin Six, the shooting of the judge at Marin County, pitting the black guerrillas against the Nazi, the White Aryan Brotherhood, putting innocent people in jail, framing people, working with Evel Younger, the Attorney General. PROCUNIER left California. He was taken from the prison work by Jerry Brown, but given another position with the old people in the old people's homes. You know how great that was. Then he was meddling around in New Mexico when those prisoners had their eyes gouged out with screwdrivers when there was that prison riot, and they went to the files, the top dog Gestapo prisoners, the meanest, went to the files and took out the names of informers and cut them open, and we had a massacre in New Mexico that has yet to be investigated or anybody to expose it. PROCUNIER was the one who resisted change. He said shake down certain kinds of bars there and put up glass, and it was the glass they broke. This cast of characters of Meese and PROCUNIER goes back a long time, and Ronald Reagan. Now, he's become the head of the state of Texas prison system. Think of that. Remember in 1974, maybe you don't, I said that those huge airports would be used for taking people out of the country, and mentioned this many times. Procunier is a evil man who, if he were exposed, like we did after the war with Himmler or Goering or Mengele or Goebbels, why do we have to wait till so many people die and pin a few names when it happened in this country, in the state of California? And now he's moved to Texas. And there are other large articles. We will take a 1-minute break now. It's on the half hour. We'll stop with Procunier for 1 minute, and I'll take a 1-minute break because we split at that time. And I'll do more on Procunier. I do want to identify the station. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. Now we'll go back to side 2 of broadcast 653. And I just want to say that getting this article from the Houston Post on Raymond Procunier, I couldn't believe it. He's the guy that says lock him up and lock him up forever. He was behind the plans of Ronald Reagan, as I say, to put the electrodes, the brain experiments, the Vacaville mind control. He was the head of the prisons when Donald DeFreeze was molded and meeting with his fellows and the SLA people that came out from Indiana, the NARC squad, Emily and William Harris and their friends Angela and Gary Outwood, and formed in the prison with a L.A. policeman, an informer for them, Donald DeFreeze, and set up the SLA so they'd have an excuse of terrorism in America, and then they could infiltrate the Venceremos, the farm workers, the United Prisoners Union, and the truly left, the anti-war movement, and so forth, and the lesbians, the gays, and all the disparate individual groups. The police could break up and infiltrate and try to bring into the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, the heiress who's now married to a cop from San Francisco and doing quite well. Okay, but Procunier was behind all of that, and he wants people, like he says now, prisons are for punishment, not rehabilitation. And he's in Texas. I'm not going into the subject tonight. Next week, I'll talk about the University of Texas and Bobby Inman and the massive computers that we've talked about before. The Houston Post this week had a full-page article on Mr. Hans Mark, who came here from Germany, who's to be the new president of the University of Texas, the first out-of-state person where all these millions are being donated using the computers of Bobby Inman from the National Security Agency and the CIA and Task Force 157. Mr. Mark is from NASA, and I'll read you a hair-raising story or outline it for you. But Raymond Procunier, if people remember this era in California when Reagan was governor, how righteous that the power of Procunier is in Texas, because that is where the computer banks are, the IRS banks for data on people in Houston, the power of a lot of the intelligence community, and John Connolly down there building his empire by the millions with land investments. Houston, Dallas, and Austin, Texas, are places to watch. And the fact that the state of Texas got Procunier as the head of the prisons, and I see those huge airports, the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, that massive airport, for mass migration of population in the future. I rarely predict, but I stand by what I said about Texas. And when this man moves to Texas and Inman moves to Texas and the millions are going down there, it is pretty bad. Now, there was an article it was about a year ago on dangerous files, keeping records on people in the FBI, dangerous files on dangerous people. And one person, Richard Burris, is saying the Secret Service needs help. And the other articles by Don Edwards saying, here comes 1984 again. Don Edwards, the congressman, was in the FBI, and he's on the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights. He chairs it, and he claims that it is very dangerous what is happening to this country. The defender of keeping records on people, this Richard Burris, is from Stanford Hoover Institute. He was a former FBI agent and worked with the House Committee, and he was assistant to President Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, Crook Nixon, and Ford, appointed by Crook Nixon, who was on the Warren Commission. Now at Stanford, the Hoover Institute saying, yes, we need the names of all these various people, and Mr. Edwards saying, no, we don't. It is a horrendous sight, the power these people have gotten. And I just wanted to cite a few articles that came out just this last week on the intention for war, the intention for the teams against terrorism, the building up of terrorism at the International London Congress, and avoiding the real issues. Now, Reagan just came back from London, and I just want to give you a few items about his trip to China before we get on to London, to give you a little dose of what he is. The newspaper proclaims him, Joseph Kraft, this week. The president is now in the position to claim peacemaker title. He's not proving his sincerity or his effectiveness, but he says the Democrats are divided, and a few gestures that Ronald Reagan makes will be sufficient to show that he's a peacemaker. The London Times has a large article. Remember, I was talking about these little teeny tiny articles that had important news. Well, I never saw 1 week that had full page or 2-3 pages of items or stories. London Times, April 20th, 1984, has a story about Mr. Wirthlin, 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 the fellow who runs the campaign for Ronald Reagan, who went to China with him and has a computer and sizes all of us up. Wirthlin's name came up because he had hired Mrs. Meese along with Mr. Moss from Texas and Robert Keith Gray to bail them out of their financial problems. He has the public relations office in Washington that computerizes everything we should think or feel about Ronald Reagan as running for president. It's called Decision Making Information. He gets $1 million a year. He represents Campbell's Soup, Pepsi-Cola, and Purina Pet Food. That's Ronald Reagan's campaign manager. He programs them. And as the London Times said, Ronald Reagan has started running for re-election. He uses his trips to foreign capitals to boost his image as an international statesman. Minding the campaign shop back home is the most sophisticated, computerized opinion testing system in the world. This is the London Times telling how he predicts what you think, how he arranges where Reagan should go, when he should meet Catholics, when he should meet Hispanics. And it's a long article on the details of programming every gesture that the president makes at every airport. What he doesn't tell you about, you have to read other places. A listener to this broadcast up in Oregon sent me one of the most shocking articles I've seen in a long time. It's from the Vancouver, Washington paper, The Columbian, May 25th. It said when Ronald Reagan was in China, I mean, you have him with the chopsticks and the China wall. When he was in China, he was recently making a decision, it said, to agree with China that if they have nuclear technology, they could store China's nuclear waste in the United States. Up in Hanford, Washington, is to be the world's end waste site. The law calls for they have a law creating a permanent waste storage site. And there's several sections that have been selected, and the U.S. News and World Report had an article about decisions on putting nuclear waste where they could put it and how they will get rid of it for 3.5 decades. For 35 years, the United States has spent $4 billion storing this material, and they're going to spread it in Mississippi or Nevada, and the map shows Hanford Reservation up in Washington. Think of the rivers and the seepage and the fish and the salmon, and U.S. News was talking about different states saying not here. But Reagan had a very successful trip in China. China isn't big enough, you understand? So why is it so successful? He says, you put in nuclear weapons or nuclear power and send your waste to us. They'll have to change this script under the Statue of Liberty. She's being remodeled. So they'll have to say, send us your tired, cancerous, birth defect-causing nuclear waste. Mr. Ruckelshaus, William Ruckelshaus, the Environmental Protection Agency administrator, said last week the Democrats exploit the toxic waste issue. He's wrong. The Democrats are asleep. They've already been poisoned. There's no more for them to say. I don't hear them saying anything. A man goes to China. Now, while he's in China, there was a story in the Washington Post, May 2nd, 1984, out of Taiwan. Richard Allen, the national security advisor, at the same time that Ronald Reagan is promising China these goodies, is speaking to a group on Taiwan relations, and this is what he's saying. He said the simple fact of the matter is that mainland China is not, cannot, and will not be an ally of the United States. Neither are we in a loose alliance with the communist regime there. This is Richard Allen, a senior counselor for foreign policy, national security, the Republican National Committee, who was kicked out as national security advisor with his finger in the financial till. He's telling them over there, don't worry, they're not an ally of the United States. If they're not an ally, or even if they are, why send their nuclear dump to any one of our 50 states? Are our states going to become the nuclear repository? Yes, they have been. He's promising it. How does he get everything he wants and comes home so happy? He gives them everything they want. Another story about his Chinese trip, L.A. Herald. Reynolds Tobacco into China market. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company has now gained access to the world's largest tobacco market in agreement with the Chinese government under a $20 million contract. The tobacco will be produced at a Chinese factory. Estimated 250 million smokers in China will use it, and this was opened up. They will be the first U.S. company to penetrate China's barrier against foreign firms selling jointly made products in the domestic market. Now, in a story about Robert Keith Gray, who I referred to many times on the air, it was the LA Times, the May 13th article on Robert Keith Gray. Among his clients are the American Tobacco Company, American Express, don't leave home without it, and the American Tobacco Company, as well as NBC, that's the Marvin Kalb connections, Haiti, Turkey. But Mr. Gray, Keith Gray, who runs Ronald Reagan's inauguration, who's close to Mr. Casey and Paul Laxalt and the powers that be in Washington, sells those poor Chinese $250 million tobacco. That's another deal he made, nuclear waste and tobacco. May 24th, a week later, Surgeon General links smokers to lung disease. A lot of strong articles. We've known it for years, but a strong story. One week later on lung disease. Forget it, China. First, the British gave you opium. We'll give you tobacco. That's the Ronald Reagan trip to China. The nuclear waste deposits over here, the tobacco for the Chinese and Mr. Gray's clients. It is horrendous what he gets away with, and he does it well. Now, I want to update a few deaths and murders because there's so many that if I did 1 hour a week on just the deaths, we would be busy every week, and so I don't want them to pile up too hard, and there's some serious questions about some of these murders, and I want to share them with you. First of all, there is the new book out, In God's Name, an investigation into the murder of Pope John Paul I. I just got it this afternoon. Someone called me and got a hold of it. It is available in the stores. I looked up the part of Licio Gelli. It describes him working with the CIA, being at Reagan's inauguration. It tells about the murders in the Vatican and the role of Paul Marcinkus. And it describes 6 men who had something to lose if they didn't kill John Paul I. One was Cardinal Jean Villot, V-I-L-L-O-T, the Vatican secretary. He was murdered just a short while ago. It goes into his murder. The other was Roberta Calvi, and he was murdered in London. Licio Gelli, who fled the country and is in Argentina and South America. Michael Sindona, who's wanted for murder charges of his investigator of his banks and for breaking the Franklin National Bank in New York. Cardinal John Cody in Chicago, who I said was tied into the Continental Illinois Bank, and he died of a quick heart attack just when his name came into the service, one of those apparent heart attacks. And Paul Marcinkus. These are the people involved in killing Pope John Paul I. Marcinkus, and he uses words. I love this author. He talks like Mae Brussell. He says Marcinkus is hiding in the Vatican and can't come out. He describes $100,000 that this Pope John Paul II gave to Solidarity. He describes Cicero, Illinois, and the Al Capone gang and how Marcinkus was raised in the Al Capone territory. And the very exact time that Capone died in 1947 is when Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, left for Rome, and he describes Cardinal Spellman handpicking Paul Marcinkus for his role. The book is really fantastic. I only had about an hour to look at it before I came to the station, and my mind was blown. I was looking up in the index certain things, and what I like about it is most subjects of books that come out have everything but the things I talk to you about on the air. And this guy's from Great Britain. He's done 3 years' work in other books, and he's talking about the Al Capone gang, the mafia, and about, as I ran through it, I fingered about 20 murders right there. So you can get this book. It's by David Yallop, Yallop. Bantam published it, and would you know, it's the choice for a alternative of the Book of the Month Club. My goodness, what's happening in America? I think these are the Rockefeller Protestants getting back at the Vaticans. I wouldn't be surprised, and there is a heavy war. I'll go into more of that later. Now, the New York Times has a full page, 2 full pages on the shooting of the Pope and Ajah. I can't detail it for you. It just came out yesterday, Sunday Times, and I usually outline these things, but if you go to the libraries, you can copy it. It lists the cast of characters involved in trying to kill the Pope, and it goes into Mr. Bagci, B-A-G-C-I, who is a member of the Grey Wolves. That's the Nazi organization that we referred to, where Ajah stored his rifle, to Mr. Katil, C-A-T-L-I, the Turk, a Grey Wolf leader, another Nazi leader, Mr. Salebi, a Grey Wolf leader. These are the Nazis out of Frankfurt, Germany. Mr. Selig, a Grey Wolf leader, and the Nazis. There's as many Nazis as they are Bulgarians. And remember, Otto von Bolshevik had property in Bulgaria and set up Reinhard Gehlen's agents inside of Bulgaria. It describes Mr. Tintner, the arms dealer in Vienna, who provided the weapon for Ajah. So what you're going to get is a story of as many Nazis as they aren't leftists. They wanted to get rid of the Pope. But if you take all the murders of John Paul I and the scandals coming down, there was more reason for the right wing and Licio Gelli and those people to get rid of John Paul II after John Paul I was murdered, because they had to cover their past. Look at 4 out of the 6 are dead now. And why not try with Frank Turple and the CIA, not only to get rid of the Pope, who's a witness to Marcinkus and the banking problems, to blame it on the Russians at the same time. That's what happened with Larry McDonald. And Widow McDonald is finally catching on, and I may call her about the role of the LAPD and call down to Atlanta, Georgia, and see if she's aware. She isn't naming the Russians at all. She's naming the people who knew and sent her husband to the deathbed. And there's as much reason to get rid of John Paul II at that time in history, for sure, as there was for anybody to worry about solidarity. Now, I'm going to run down. I've got 12 minutes, and I'm going to run a few deaths quickly and share them with you because they are of a concern to all of us, I'm sure. Remember last week or 2 weeks ago, I talked about the head investigator for the Sin Fuel organization who was found in a river in Washington, D.C., in the Potomac. He was drowned, and this is another investigator for a House investigation that happened a while ago, but it's a current and always an ongoing investigation. Robert Boettcher, B-O-E-T-T-C-H-E-R, staff chief in House inquiry. He died in a fall, 44 years old, fell off the roof of an apartment in New York City. This is New York Times, May 30th, 1984. Boettcher was the staff director of the Congressional investigations of the South Korean influence peddling in Washington. He died Thursday in the fall from a roof from a building in Central Park. From 1971 to 79, he directed the staff of the House Subcommittee on International Organizations, and in that capacity, he was in charge, under Representative Donald Frazier, of gathering information of a scandal in which Tongsun Park, the South Korean millionaire and businessman, were accused of seeking influence of American political figures. He's currently head of the public relations for the Dance Theater of Harlem. Now, Reverend Moon is supposed to go to jail. There's a lot of information on Moon and the Moonies and Tongsun Park linked. The name Sven Kramer, various characters we've talked about. I have those hearings that a subscriber to this program sent me on the Koreagate hearings. Moon is not out of the news. He's a very important person, and that information has been suppressed by the late Leon Jaworski. Another staff investigator falls off a roof, age 44. Thomas S. Pillsbury died in Rapids during a recent trip over the Colorado River, 66 years old. He was a former professor of chemistry at Dominican College. He worked on the Manhattan Project, which produced the first atomic bomb. He's become violent against the atomic bomb, opposed it. He reversed his decision on it, and he's worked for the nuclear arms race to reverse the present government policy on the arms race. He was planning a trip to the Soviet Union to discuss nuclear proliferation with the trade unionists there, and he was going down the Colorado River. The boat went over the rapids. Before he could get to Russia or be against the nuclear movement, he was dead. His home is in San Francisco, but before the body got to San Francisco, they cremated it in Flagstaff, Arizona, which by air flight is 30 minutes, okay? Abe Spitzer, crewman on the A-bomb, one made the bomb and one dropped the bomb. Abe Spitzer, crewman on the A-bomb from White Plains, New York, 72 years old. He wrote a book about the bomb. We dropped the A-bomb. It was the title of his book. He published it, his account of the bomb in 1946. He was against the bomb. He was a peace-loving person. He was horrified by what he did. He was killed in an automobile accident a few minutes from home. His brother said he was killed 2 minutes from his home after he'd survived two of the most dangerous missions in the world. One man made the bomb, one man hated the bomb, and this fellow was killed just outside of his home, a car accident, and he was buried last Sunday. A general's body was found in the Potomac. The Potomac must be pretty crowded, I should think. Brigadier General William Charles Hall. This is from the Washington Times in a small article in the San Francisco Chronicle. The body of retired Army Brigadier General William Charles Hall, missing from his Washington home for 6 days, was found in the Potomac River. He appeared to have drowned. Hall, 75, was a member of General George Patton's World War II staff, so he would know Fritz Kramer because the book on Patton, written by Farrago, says that General Fritz Kramer was with Mr. Patton. He would know Fritz Kramer in Washington if Congressman Rodino's committee ever came to the push and shove. They said, we don't know how or when he died. There were no signs of foul play. He went for a walk and was found in the Potomac floating around. A Mexican journalist was shot. A violent opponent, I use the word violent because very strong against the CIA. He published a book against the CIA. A progressive writer similar to Jack Anderson described prominent Mexican journalist shot dead. Manuel Buenda, one of Mexico's best known and most read journalists, he wrote a column called Private Network. He published a book against the Central Intelligence Agency. He blamed it was called the CIA in Mexico, where he detailed CIA activity in Mexico and included the names of CIA operatives. He called us a sick society, and he wrote a column. He accused John Gavin, our ambassador, of spending his time outside of Mexico. Incidentally, John Gavin worked in Young Americans for Freedom and with Ed Butler before he became an actor and got active in politics and became the ambassador to Mexico. When you get on Gavin's shoes in the CIA, they didn't play around, no Potomac River or anything, just gunned down the leading columnist. Now, one of the saddest stories, I have to make a confession. This woman was killed. They said it was a suicide. It wasn't a suicide. As a matter of fact, when I shared the information, I'll go into the coroner of Houston, Texas. Another story about him this week, a big story. There were so many. This columnist, Leonida McClain, McClain, they said she commits suicide, and many of these suicides you find later. There was a bottle next to her bed. She's described as the most brilliant black member of the newspaper editorial board of the Chicago Tribune, one of the few in the country, described as a brilliant woman, recently written up as one of America's 10 most outstanding women in the March issue of Glamour magazine. She wrote an article to the Washington Post last July on the elections in Chicago and about the psychotic events surrounding Harold Washington, the black man. And she wrote a book on why she hates whites, that she grew up as a black woman, never to hate anybody, but the article was in the Washington Post, and she said that it hurts her so bad to see what's happening in Chicago, the racism and the shenanigans that are going on there, and how much hatred there is. It really broke her heart to see the way the whites were fighting, as if how do you work your way up in the system. And this woman died, the newspaper, of course, says, suicide ends life of columnist. And then you read on how successful she is. She's one of the few people that ever worked her way up to be. She's the first black member of the Chicago Tribune's editorial board, received journalism awards. Now, she died, it was reported May 31st. And 1 week before she died was all this controversy about Harold Washington that he had to resign, that he didn't turn in certain papers on time, his financial disclosures, and they came with the court order. They said, we have to get rid of Harold Washington. After she helped him get elected and was close to him, they were trying to kick him out of government. A few financial papers he didn't sign. Think of the difference between Edwin Meese, who wants to be the Attorney General, who's asked for an extension of a half a year to revise his financial statements that didn't disclose loans, didn't disclose income or gifts or travels. And they wanted to get this black mayor out of Chicago, and she was very close to him. Now, several weeks ago, I talked about the most successful, prominent, rich man in Washington, D.C., who was killed in a plane crash with his son, and prominent, wealthy, recognized, and close to Jesse Jackson. Now, this woman is close to Harold Washington, and she expressed the racism that the Soviet Union and other countries aren't supposed to know exists. And I felt very badly, and there's an article in the Washington Post that I have to tell you, I think it's the only newspaper article that I've read with all the murders and deaths that made me cry. I don't know why, maybe because it was so well written and maybe because of the implications it had about her death. It's written by Ronald D. White, and he wrote, I wish I had known who she was, the loss of Leonida McLean. And he says how she came to Washington, D.C., and her stories were printed in the Washington Post, and they wanted her, but that she had this job at the Chicago Tribune, her own column there, and that this particular Ronald White was supposed to check articles to see if there was racism in the paper or discrimination against Jesse Jackson. And she was telling about her work, and he said he saw her across the room, and he met her, and he liked her. And he says, I wish I had taken her to coffee. I wish I had taken her to dinner. I wish I had talked to her. She's 32-year-old, a black woman in the vanguard of breaking stereotypes and racial barriers and doing it with writing, as against, say, Malcolm X, who's saying you better get your gun, and doing it with writing, something quite like fire as an inferno in purgatory. And he said, now she is dead, and he says, by her own hands. Well, when you think of the journalists in Mexico and the various journalists being blown up down in Costa Rica, the two journalists that were killed, Mr. Pastora came out this week. He survived the bombing, Eden Pastora, and he said the CIA was behind the bombing attack, and American journalists were killed there. And we haven't played that up at all. Do you notice how that was passed over? He was the anti-Sandinista leader who said he didn't want to work with the rebel group. The American was funding because we're funding the army of Somoza, and he wants, if there's going to be a change, to get the Somoza people out. And they tried to kill him, and there were 20 journalists under medical care today. 20 of them, do you see very much about this in the news service? Hardly a word that were injured. Some were killed. A British-born correspondent for Newsweek magazine, and some of them were killed down there. And 20 are in hospitals. And Pastora survived and said the CIA did it. If the CIA did it in Mexico, if the CIA did it in Costa Rica, why couldn't they get her out? They can't stand black, brilliant people like that. Candy Jones said that when she was inducted into the Central Intelligence Agency, they taught her to hate blacks and to hate Jews and the Italian smell and the characteristics of these people because they were training them to hate them. And here was a woman working her way in the system. It almost makes you believe that there has to be a bloody revolution. Every leader who speaks up is dead. Whether it's Frank Church from cancer or Adlai Stevenson poison, Medgar Evers, who wasn't violent, killed, Malcolm X, Hubert Humphrey, a cancer. Where are the voices of opposition? These new young people in their 20s and 30s, or the prominent black person, the family in Washington, D.C., who may get a shake with somebody like Jesse Jackson making waves, a black writer with the Chicago Tribune working her way to a place where blacks have never been. And they find a bottle of pills on the table, no indications or reasons why she would do herself in. Very prosperous, very prominent, recognized around the world. Her friend was to be recalled, or they're putting pressure on him, and then a week later, she's dead. We better watch America. You better watch it. And each week I'll do 6 or 8 murders because I have a pile of them, and I don't want them to accumulate too much. And maybe if you collect these broadcasts or tapes, you'll get the picture if you didn't get it already. This is Mae Brussell. This is KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California.